Isn't in the link. Oh, there's Cecil. Okay, are you guys ready to go?
Cecil, you there?
Yeah, we should be good to go. I was just making sure my mic and everything like that was where it needed to be.
Sweet. All right. Well, in that case, everybody, thank you so much for coming, whether you're watching this later on YouTube or here with us now in the Zoom room. Today, we are hearing from our wonderful Microsoft representatives about getting started with Azure static web apps. So without further ado, I will let them take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ansh. So welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Clark. I'm joined by my colleague here, Cecil Phillip, and we're going to be talking to you about Azure static web apps. But before we get started, I want to kind of let everybody know the format of kind of what we're going to be doing today is not typical for a workshop that you might have been in before. It's mostly going to be we're going to step through some stuff. We're going to be doing this hands-on, so you can follow along if you'd like, for one. And Cecil and I are going to kind of have some conversation back and forth to ask each other questions, but it's also want to keep an open mind for you all to ask questions if you have as well while we're going through these things. So if there's something we step through that's not very clear or maybe it's a little confusing, feel free to let us know in, I guess, the Discord Microsoft channel. If you want to go there, I'll keep an eye on that. I have that open over here. But besides that, I just need one more moment. So Cecil, why don't you introduce yourself while I take care of one other thing here?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So hi, everyone. I'm Cecil. I'm out of Florida, just like Brian is. And kind of like what he said, we're going to take an approach where we're just going to kind of go through the steps of showing you what Azure Static Web Apps is, how to deploy it. We're going to have some conversation about like, why would you want to use it, or why should you even care about this thing? I think we only have an hour for this slot. So, we're going to try and get through as much of it as we can. There might be some things that we do not get to finish, but everything is on GitHub. So we're going to make sure that, you have all the links and, any type of information that you need to make sure that you could, go ahead and get through a lot of this stuff. But again, we want this to be very interactive. Definitely stop us at any point in time, ask us questions at any point in time. Feel free to like put messages in the chat. Like I'll be taking a look at that and monitoring that. Or, if you want to, just go ahead and unmute yourself. Not all at the same time, but go ahead and unmute yourself. And, we can have some conversations about some things.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, just feel free as part of this meeting to just unmute yourself and talk with us, and we'll be taking questions that way. So the workshop that we're going to be following along with is created by another colleague of ours, Christopher Harrison. I dropped the link for that in the Discord, the Microsoft Discord channel. So if you want to check that out and start getting yourself prepared to follow along, feel free to do so there. So by now, a lot of you probably made some progress on your hack projects. And one of the things you might want to do is maybe have a website and want to be able to spin something up very quickly to host a front end to your application or whatever it is that you might be hacking on. And so Azure Static Web Apps is one of those things that's going to be able to help you do that very quickly and efficiently. But before we go even further than that, I want to explain what is Azure Static Web Apps, because it's kind of like, just looking at it, reading at it, somebody maybe not have heard of that before. You might think, I mean, web apps I probably have heard of maybe as a web developer in the industry here, but what does static necessarily mean? And Azure I'm familiar with, right? So like that's at Microsoft, it's the cloud. So static web apps, in my mind, you think of it like a traditional website where, early on with the web, we were building out websites with a server that hosted files. And so that's kind of what we mean by the static side of things, or at least my interpretation of what I feel it means, is that it's about serving static files that are not going to be changing. There's not really an API that is part of the hosting server for my website. And so especially with today's day and age of building web apps, well, we have these front-end frameworks like Angular, Vue, and React, right? Or Svelte even is a more recent one that has started to emerge and become popular. So you have those, and those kind of, while it doesn't feel like they're static because they dynamically change the views and like load different aspects of your application in the browser for your users, it really is still hosting static files, just straight up files like JavaScript files, HTML, and CSS. So in my mind, that's kind of the way I would describe what a static web app is. And so that's what Azure's trying to do, is trying to just host those files for you in an efficient way and in a very resourceful way, so that you can focus on that as just your front end side of things. Now, that's not to say that it can't still talk to and communicate and make API requests to another API server or a serverless application, which, if you're not familiar with that, we'll get into details on that throughout this workshop. But you can do all that stuff, is the point I'm trying to make. It just means that on its own, it can run fine and maybe still talk to other things outside of the scope of that project. So I think that's fairly what I would describe it. But Cecil, anything you might have to add to what Azure Static Web Apps means to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, like, if I'm assuming if anyone has ever deployed a web app before, you usually think about, like, there's a web server and then there's, some stuff that happens on that server, right? Like, so that might be, I'm going to run like a Java thing or a Python thing or a .NET thing or whatever. But, the actual work of that is happening on the server versus happening on the client. Kind of like what Brian was saying, right? And so that's when we get like those more of a dynamic feel, like that dynamic web application type, request response type scenario. Versus with Azure Static Web Apps and with static web apps in general, we're talking about like having the work be done on the client versus on the server, right? So it happens in your browser or, whatever your JavaScript hosted client happens to be. And so what Azure Static Web Apps does is that it makes that scenario a little bit easier versus like some of the other offerings we have that are not for static web apps. You know what I mean? So, we'll talk more about the details of that as we go on, but, you'll see things about like routing and, being able to handle, cross domain requests and, hosting and like all these different types of things that are very specific to static web apps that, we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. I was just pulling up the chat of Zoom too, just to see if somebody feels more comfortable asking questions there. I have that open as well to keep an eye out. All right. So with that, I think what do you say, Cecil? We jump into the
let's just get
workshop.
to it.
All right. So Christopher here set up a scenario for us where let's say we want to display a list of dog names on a page. So we're like, maybe we're trying to figure out we just got a new puppy and we want to figure out the name of the dog that we want to give to it. So we'll start by running everything in the client, right? So create a front end application and deploy that to Azure. And then we'll add server-side code through Azure Functions and test it locally. We'll close by deploying our changes to Azure. All of this will be completed with just a few tools installed locally, GitHub, and of course, Azure. So with that, let's talk about some of the things that you might need to get started with this. One is Node.js, and in particular, so that you can run some of this functionality locally without having to run it, without having to necessarily deploy it right away. That's not to say that you have to have Node in order to do all this, because again, like we were talking about before, with Azure Static Web Apps, the idea is you're not having to write the server-side code in order to host this application. It's just being hosted for you, kind of thing. But if you want to test out some of the server-side stuff that we're going to be doing and run that locally with Azure Functions, which is what I was describing earlier, it's a serverless type of application, then you're going to need some of this. Now, when it comes to installing Node, if you're not familiar with it, for the purposes of speaking of dogs, the purposes of this project, I don't believe we'll be writing. We probably will be writing some Node code, JavaScript code. But if you're not familiar with Node, that's fine. We'll step you through that. What I want to point out though is if you haven't installed Node before on your machine, the one tool that I like to go to help with managing the installation of Node instead of installing it from the website directly is these tools that are called NVM. So Node Version Management, Node Version Manager tools. In particular, they make one for Windows and one for Linux and Mac OS based solutions. So if you go to GitHub and you look for, you just search for NVM via the search option up here, you'll be able to find the NVM that's for Mac and Linux, and then you'll find one that's for Windows. It's NVM Windows. And what it does is it basically will isolate the installation of your node to a certain area that you get to choose on your machine instead of installing it at a system level, which can be a little bit, which is fine at first sight when you install this, but I can assure you as a experienced Node developer, you're going to want to switch between versions over time and update to new ones. And that could be a little bit of a painful process to go through, at least in my experience I've found. So these types of tools, Node Version Manager helps make it very simple to step through that. So this is the route I would recommend folks go if they're going to be installing Node for the first time on their machine. Again, this is the one for Mac OS. And if I go back to the search that I did on GitHub, so this first one, if you search NVM in GitHub, the first one is for Mac and Linux. And then this other one, NVM Windows, is for Windows. So there you go with that. Any questions there, or Cecil? Just as a quick check, what is everyone's
Yeah,
experience?
I've been checking the chat. No questions yet, but I would like to ask some questions. So for folks that are here,
Okay.
I'm just kind of curious, like for everyone that's in the workshop right now, do you have any of these tools set up already? Because I'm asking too, because I know sometimes they could take a little while for them to get set up on your machine. So like Node, well, no, Node's not that bad, but like things like Azure Functions code tools, and having an Azure account and a GitHub account. I'm just kind of curious what everyone's level is, so that as Brian and I are having this conversation, we know how deep, or how we can have that conversation to make sure everyone is able to get something out of it. So let us know if you're familiar with GitHub, if you're familiar with an Azure account and what that looks like, or if you're not, like, let us know. Because these are things that we could take the time to explain to you as we go through this, to make sure that everyone has a good time.
Okay. It looks like a couple of folks in chat were saying that they have VS Code and GitHub. They have strong experience with Node.js. Okay. Oh, and then we have some that say very little. Appreciate you all letting us know, because that's going to help us gauge like Cecil was saying, how deep we go into things and explaining them thoroughly, or just kind of skimming over some stuff.
Yeah.
But not with Node.js. I have GitHub and VS Code. Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, so as long as you have a GitHub VS Code, the other thing that I even had to install was the Azure Function Core tool. So if you go again, let me drop this in the Zoom chat. This is the link to that workshop in case you want to get a head start while we're talking through some of these things. This I had to install on my machine, the Azure Function Core tools. Again, this is the stuff to let you run stuff locally on your machine and test it before actually deploying it. And that's when we get to the server side stuff. But enough of that. You have an Azure account. If you haven't signed up for that yet, there's an Azure for Students offer. So if you go to aka.ms, I'll drop that link in the chat as well. aka.ms/A4S, Azure for Students. That'll allow you to sign up for an Azure account. I guess let us know in the chat too if you have an Azure account, or if you're signing up for it as well. If you run into any issues with that, let us know. We'll be happy to help you out with that. And you get $100 free credit. But the good thing is here, at least for the Azure Static Web App stuff, it's in preview right now. And so it is completely free. I see a question in chat says, will you still be able to use Azure after the $100 credit is used? Yes. Yes. The answer is yes. Essentially, I think, like, and Cecil, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. Essentially, is if you don't enter in any payment information to be able to beyond that, which you're not required to with the initial sign up. But if you want to go beyond the $100, if you want to go and use more resources from Azure beyond the $100 credit, you will need to have payment information entered to go beyond that.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess to add on to that, so an Azure account technically is free, right? And when I say free, like, there are things in Azure that you could use that would not cost money. There are things that you could work with and try out that don't cost money. So like, your Azure account is not what you're paying for. What you do pay for is the usage of resources that do cost money. So for instance, if you wanted to spin up like a virtual machine, that costs money, right? Like, if you wanted to spin up, a certain amount of storage, or you want to spin up like, some web things, or some serverless things, or some messaging things, right? Like, some of these have free tiers, so that you could, they'll be free to a certain extent. But, when you start talking about like, things that need daily usage, things that are going to be getting accessed and hit on a regular basis, then for sure, like, you're definitely going to have to start paying for that. So what will happen is that, like, your credits will go as long as they don't expire, or as long as you don't use them all up. But after that $100, you'll still have an Azure account. You just won't be able to like use new resources. Like, again, resources being like new virtual machines, or messaging things and services and things of that nature, if there's no money, or if there's no payment information on the account.
Yep. And I forgot exactly where, but I remember we have a link somewhere that kind of describes what everything that you get for free. Like, because there's a bunch of different products and services that are available in Azure beyond just like today, we're going to be focusing on Azure Static Web Apps and a little bit of Azure Functions. But pretty much every product, or most products at least within Azure, have a free level of, or free use level of use is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, maybe go to Azure for Students, because that might be a helpful place for them to see. So you just go azuremicrosoft.com/students. And I think what that will do is, okay, and if you scroll to the bottom, somewhere in the bottom, it'll show you, right? So these are some of the things that you do get for free. Like you see some free machine learning workspaces, SQL Server Developer Edition. You get a free, free amount of hours, right, for certain things, free amount of storage for certain things. And that's free per month, right? That's not free and it expires. Like the next month, you'll just get another allotment. So for instance, if we look at that Azure Functions one that's at the bottom left side, that's 1 million requests per month. So that means that if you don't use all your 1 million, you just get another million the next month or whatever, right? So and also it doesn't roll over. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. So if you don't use it for 2 months, that doesn't mean you have 2 million requests. You know what I'm saying? It just means that for this particular month, for this particular time period, that's what you have.
Cool. All right, let's move on. So core steps that we're going to go through today, we're going to start with an HTML project, and we're going to push our code to GitHub, and we're going to create a static web app project in Azure, on Azure, and deploy our code there. And then beyond there, time permitting, we're going to go and add Azure Functions for server functionality. So that's the point of what we were talking about, where we might have an external API that our web app might call to, and then we deploy any updates to Azure. So if you want to learn more, as you step through, after you get through all this stuff, these are resources here to bring you to docs.microsoft.com, which is our main location you'd want to go to learn more about all the different products and how to do specific things within them as well. So let's go to the first one here, start with an HTML project. All right, so we're going to creating a starting project. We're going to start with a core HTML, CSS, JavaScript project. You can use whatever JavaScript framework you would like with Azure Static Web Apps. So like we were talking about before, Angular, React, Vue, Svelte, just plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All that is fine because it's all just the front end stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a directory in our terminal. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. Have it open here. I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to press Control backtick to bring up the terminal view in the bottom. I'm going to go into a folder, cd dev, and in here I have a developer folder where we need to make a new directory. That new directory is Azure Static Web Apps Workshop. So we're going to copy that. We're going to make dir. So mkdir in here is going to make a directory for us. And I'm going to paste in the name of that folder. And then I'm going to change directories into, I want to change into that folder. And now I'm within my terminal, I'm in the context of that folder. So now if we go back over here, next step, we want to open up Visual Studio Code to that folder. I already have Visual Studio Code open up. So a little quick tip and trick for folks. If I were to go like this and say code dot, it's going to open up a new instance of Visual Studio Code instead of using the one that I already have open here. So one thing I need to change too is that I'm using the insiders build, so don't mind that. That's just a different version of Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to use this option called -R. And what that will do is it will reload that folder or open that folder in the current instance of Visual Studio Code that I have. So I hit enter on that and it reloads. And now we can see in the Explorer view in the top right that I'm in that folder, ASWA Workshop. Okay. And again, if I'm going too fast or anything like that, please let us know in the chat or just speak up. All right, so in Visual Studio Code, we're going to create a new HTML file, index.html, using the Bootstrap snippets extension. We're going to do that. All right, so let's talk. I don't think I have the Bootstrap snippets extension, so I'll step through all of this with everybody here.
Yeah.
So we're going to create
an opportunity to show folks how to install extensions in Visual Studio Code, just in case you haven't had the opportunity to do that before.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing I'll mention too here for everyone, it might, even though things might look different based on how I set up my instance of Visual Studio Code, you should be able to find all the same stuff that I'm going through here. So your Explorer view might be on the other side, toggle sidebar position. So normally it starts off on default on the left. I personally like it on the right. So that's just the big difference that you might see there. All right, so we want a new file. We can click on this icon here. It'll add a new file, and I'm going to call it index.html. And so VS Code is going to create that file directly in the folder that we had created. Now I need to install that extension that was mentioned here. It's this one. Open link in new tab. So I checked that out. It's called Bootstrap 4 Font Awesome 4. And there's basically snippets that we want to use. And what snippets are is it allows you to kind of scaffold out, generate code for you without having to like rewrite things over and over again, because it gets very, you want to save your keystrokes, right? You don't want to have to keep typing the same code over and over again. So snippets let you do that. Think of it as like text expansion too, that you get with like, your mobile phones and things like that. That's kind of what snippets is making available to us. So I'm just I could click this and then it's going to install it that way. But I personally just like to search for it in the extensions view within VS Code. So I'm going to go there. The extensions view here is this little blocks, the building blocks that are on the side. I click on that and then I'm going to search for Bootstrap 4 Font Awesome. And there it is by the same author. Okay. I'm going to click install and then we're good to go. Done. Easy as that. So now the next steps in the workshop says we type B4 $. So if I do that, looking at this GIF, this animated GIF, or do you say GIF, Cecil?
I say GIF.
I say GIF as well. We want that
GIF is
option.
for peanut butter.
It's for peanut butter.
GIF is for peanut butter, man.
GIF is for peanut butter. Yeah, I agree. All right. All right. So we're going to say B4 $, and we're going to choose this second option. And then that generated all of that fun code for us.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of stuff. Okay.
Yeah. Looks like what that does is it added Bootstrap Cdn. So we got Bootstrap installed there, some jQuery, good old jQuery, and then Popper.js and some more Bootstrap stuff there that we can use later on.
Okay.
All right.
And then just quickly for folks that, I just want to make sure that I know some folks may or may not be familiar with that stuff. So Brian, if you could go really quickly back over to Visual Studio Code. So what's happening is that those snippets, essentially what they did was, they kind of, like Brian said, they scaffolded out the code that you're seeing here. You know what I mean? It's kind of like shortcuts, pretty much like shortcuts to code, so to speak, at least for like the base of your code. And like the pieces that you're seeing here now is really just, us as in like your app going out to a CDN. I'm pulling in Bootstrap, I'm pulling in jQuery. So they're not on your machine. They're hosted on some other website. But as your website runs, it'll be able to pull those things in and then we'll be good to go.
Yes. The other thing I did following the steps here, we set the title to ASWA dogs, and now we're going to add the core display elements. So just below body, add the following code. And I'm just going to do some copy pasta here, straight up.
Copy pasta.
Copy pasta. We're going to add that right below. Oh, the article part is what we wanted, not the body. The body.
It's lunchtime over here too. You're making me hungry now.
I ate. I ate before this, man. You should have ate already.
I should have done that. I have a smoothie though, but I'm going to still be hungry after that.
You got to come prepared. All right, this will add a Bootstrap container and a list group. So we're creating an article and then an unordered list, UL, with the class list group. These are bootstrappy type of things. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, it's just a CSS kind of framework that helps styling for folks like myself, where I'm not very good at designing stuff and making things pretty. All right, so and then we're going to add a reference to a script file. So we're going to do that towards the bottom of the body tag there. So let's head back over to VS Code. Go to the bottom of the body and add our own script. So what this is going to do is it's going to let us, we're essentially, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. We haven't created this yet, but we're going to create our own JavaScript file that will help manage and, work with this HTML file, the index.html that we're working with. All right. Now let's create the client-side JavaScript. Bam. All right, in Visual Studio Code, create a new file named local-index.js, and then we're going to add an array to store a set of JavaScript objects we'll use as our list of dogs, okay? So I'm going to copy this ahead of time, and then we're going to come back over to Visual Studio Code, create a new file called index.local.js, and we'll paste that in there, and we're rocking and rolling. All right, I just want to double check. Oh, it's local. I named it wrong. That I already made a mistake. So if I want to do that, I right click on it and click rename, or you press the keyboard shortcut F2 in VS Code.
Yeah.
Bam. And then I hit enter and it's renamed. All right. I'm going to keep moving along, especially with the time that we have right now. We're almost halfway through. So let's create a function for adding items to the UI and add the following JavaScript to display the list of dogs. All right. So we want this function. In JavaScript, we're just writing a function here that's going to help display. This is a function that we'll be able to call to get all these documents, HTML elements in the HTML document, list items, and add them based on the dog names that we have here in this array of dogs.
Right.
Array of
So
objects.
for folks that are, again, I know you got a lot of new folks. So what it's doing is it's literally creating script tags for us. It's creating HTML tags for us. So instead of us doing that in the HTML file and doing it manually, like we're using a little bit of JavaScript to do it dynamically instead, right? So like the li tag is going to be like a child tag of the UL, which stands for unordered list, right? Unordered just means that like it's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just item, 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 item. You know what I mean? It's unsorted, so to speak. But now it's able to come in here and dynamically add some of those JavaScript things to it. I'm sorry, some of that HTML concepts to it, right? So you notice there'll be a class name, which is also a bootstrappy thing. And there's also the inner text, which would be like, what's the content of my list item? So what I'm expecting to see is an unordered list with like, Sammy's the first one, and Roscoe's the second one, and Artichoke. Is that dog really named Artichoke?
I don't know.
And Artichoke is the second one, and then Pookie's the fourth one. So I'm.
All right, cool. I didn't take notice of the dog names until you called it out there, but yes.
I have never heard about a dog named Artichoke, but that's stranger things have happened, right?
Yes. All right, so we will eventually need Async Await as part of our demo to make our refactoring a little easier. We're going to put in the infrastructure we'll need now in order to do that. So let's create a new async function called main, call it display dogs, and then call main. So we're just gonna add this code in here and another bit of copy pasta. I'm gonna add it here. And there we go. So next up in here, we want to test our page. So I saved all of them already. In VS Code, press Control-Shift-P to open the command palette and type and select a live server, open live server. I have not set that up yet. So we need to add live server as an extension that I need in my project. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to search for live server. And I believe that's it, right? Let's double check. I want to make sure it matches the prerequisites that we were talking about before. Live server. Ritwick there. Okay, so we need that one. Back to Visual Studio Code. That's the one. I'm going to install it. Taking a moment while it's doing that. Let's get back to where we were in the workshop.
Yeah. And so let's talk again really quickly. So we're installing live server because it's going to give us like a really lightweight HTML server. So instead of us having to set up like Nginx or Apache or like another thing, right inside of Visual Studio Code, we should just be able to like, I'm guessing, point it at a folder and run a thing. And then now that index.html will be running inside of that server.
Yes. So the other thing to mention with this is now installing that, it's basically going to create a very lightweight way of hosting locally, right? The files, the static files that we want to host on our machine and test them out and run them. Another way we could do this is we could just, if I wanted to, I thought there used to be like, I could just open this in my browser, but I guess that option's not there. I'm going to open up my folders here. And I'm going to go to this folder in my Windows Explorer really quick. Bear with me just a moment, because I want to double check that we can do this, because this is a really simple way we can go about opening this. I clicked open. There we go. Yeah. So what you could potentially do is you can just, knowing without having to have a server is what I want to point out here. So if you don't feel comfortable maybe installing live server and having that host your application for you or your website for you, you can just open these files directly from the folder on your machine. So you can see I have it in the BC dev folder, ASWA workshop index.html, and then that displayed what we would expect to display, all the dog names in the HTML file now. Now, just really quick to make everything complete here. If we wanted to follow the workshop directly, exactly as they said, we're going to open up the command palette and we're going to look for the live server open with live server. So we're going to go back over to Visual Studio Code. I'm in the index file, Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P if you're on Mac OS. We're going to search for live server, open with live server, the second option. I click on that, and there we go. It's the same thing. I have a browser extension that's making it dark mode, but that's, you can see now it's running a local server on my local host on port 5500 and hosting up that index HTML. So same thing, just two different ways about doing it. Just explain that to everybody.
Nice.
All right. What is next in the workshop? So yeah, we get to see that. That's good. Oops, clicked on the wrong thing. I clicked on the image. Next steps. Now let's push out to GitHub so we can eventually deploy it to Azure. So Cecil, I mean, it sounded like most folks in the chat are familiar with GitHub, but what's like a quick explanation of what GitHub is about?
Sure. I like to think about GitHub as the place that we not only store our code, but it's a place that we could also collaborate with others, and we could also like create versions. Like we can maintain different versions of our code. So, you know, this is great, particularly now since, you know, most of us are all home and we're working remotely and we're not in the same classroom or we're not in the same office. And, you know, you can imagine if Brian and I are working on a project together, you know, we don't live in the same house. We'd even live on the same street. We're all in different cities and communities. If you wanted to collaboratively work on like the same file or the same project or even like just the same program, you know what I mean? GitHub is a great way that we could, you know, collaborate together and share, share updates and, you know, even just have conversations about like issues and plans and what we want to do. We could do code reviews on there. We could, you know, we can have other folks that, you know, might want to contribute, come in there and contribute as well. But, you know, in general, it's just a really good place for you to be able to store your code and share it with other ones. And also to kind of go around and see what other people are working on and maybe even get some inspiration from them as well.
Yeah. And the one thing I want to call out is that the underlying technology it's using is Git, right? Git is a source control management tool that allows us to keep a history and like what changes were made over time for our code in our projects, even files. It doesn't have to be code. It could be documentation that you might want to do, or like notes and what you've studied and your research you've done. You could use Git to keep track of that kind of stuff. Cool. So in this second step of the workshop, Christopher has us going and creating a new GitHub repository. So one way you could do that is by going to this link, or if you're logged in already, in the top right-hand corner, you'll see this little plus icon. You can say new repository. And we're going to call it ASWA dogs. We're going to make it public. We're going to go new. We're going to call it so it's going to be under my account, Clark Yo, ASWA dogs, and dog names for the Azure Static Web Apps Workshop. All right, and then I'm going to set that public. And I usually like to add a README and a license, and just choose a license and create the repository. So I clicked on that. Excellent. Now I feel like I lost my place though. Here we are. Yes. So now we need to enable our local repository. So in Visual Studio Code, we're going to open up the integrated terminal. As Christopher put in here, it's control backtick or command backtick if you're on Mac OS. And then in there, we're going to say git init, git add. We're going to run all that stuff. So let's start doing this side by side now, actually, so it's a bit easier to follow along. Press Control B to hide that, make this a little bit smaller. And we can probably open up control backtick. So now we're here. So now I'm going to say I'm in the terminal within Visual Studio Code. I'm going to say I'm in the folder. This is very important to be in the right folder of where your project lives. You're going to say git init. All right, so now it initializes a Git repository, which essentially just creates this new folder .git in there and some configuration. We're going to say git add, which means it's going to add all the stuff that's already currently in this folder to prepare it to be stored into source control. And we do the dot to say like add everything that's in the current folder. And then we're going to add a commit with a message of initial commit.
Yeah. And let's take a moment really quickly too to dive a little bit deeper and really make sure everyone understands what a repository even is. So what Brian did in the previous step was he created a repository on GitHub, right? So like we said, like GitHub is, a project that's backed by Git, Git being the source control tool. But on GitHub, it lives on the internet, right? On github.com. But now if we want to work with some of those files locally on our machines, like if I want to work it on my machine and Brian wants to work it on his machine, we have to pull that down, right? Essentially, we call it like cloning or, doing like a pull, right? I want to reach out to GitHub and bring that stuff on my machine. Assuming that there was stuff there. So that means that I have to have a repository in GitHub, but I also have to have one locally as well. Think about it like your workspace, right? Like your canvas, if you're like, an artist, right? And you're into like painting stuff. But now what's happening in this particular scenario is that, well, we just created a repo and there's nothing in it because, we haven't started to put anything in it yet. But there is stuff on Brian's computer. So now he's going to use his local repository, because remember, we have a local one and one on GitHub. He's going to use his local repository. He's going to push that stuff from GitHub. From his computer, from, /dev/AWSA workshop. And he's going to connect that to the repository that's in GitHub. So that's pretty much what we're talking about and we're doing in this step.
Yeah, precisely. Now, and I while you're going through that, Cecil, I noticed there's a little bit of a mix-up, I think, or that's a correction that we need to make in this workshop, in that the repository name that we're looking to connect to is not ASWA dogs. So what Christopher has us going here is we're going to execute the following code in the integrated terminal, but we need to make modifications to this URL here. This needs to match the URL of that repository we created in GitHub earlier, which was, where'd it go? Right here. So this is right here. And typically, where is it? Because I'm in this.
Yeah, you have to, you got to expand it. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so I'm going to click on, when you're looking at your main repository page, you're going to click on the green code button, hit the HTTPS URL, and you can just copy it like that. And then you don't have to worry about manually changing things up yourself. So if we go back over here, we're going to say git, over here, I want to make this a bit bigger so people can read it. We're going to say git remote add origin, and then we're going to paste in that URL. So what this is doing is it's basically like we created in GitHub through the website a repository, and then I have my repo locally, the contents that's supposed to be for that repository on my machine, and I need to connect the two and tell Git what's the other remote area to store this repository. So I have a local instance and then I have a remote instance. So we're saying, hey, add a remote instance, call it origin, and use this URL for it. I'm gonna hit enter on that. And so that's done. Everything's fine. Then we're gonna say git branch -m and master. And what that's doing is it's creating a new branch and saying that the current stuff that we have, we're gonna be putting into that branch. And then we're gonna push, git push, we're gonna push it up to the origin. Let me actually, hold on. Clear my screen so it's a little bit. Git push -u for up origin to that branch. And now that, to show you really quick, there's nothing in here right now. And then it noticed that I just pushed it. It said recent pushes less than a minute ago. So if I refresh the page, we should see we have this README. If we view the code, refresh the page. What happened? Where is index and local index.js?
Did you add them?
Oh,
do git status.
No. So here's what happened. So I have my GitHub account, and maybe folks might have this as well. I have my GitHub account to set up my main branch to be called main. And so because we changed it, because we were using based on the workshop, the name master, it pushed that up as a separate branch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly do what's called a pull request. So we're comparing. So this is where the files went. And I need to reset my view.
And then just, and not to confuse anyone too, but another option you could do. So what Brian's going to do right now is he's going to, those two branches that exist in GitHub, he's just going to take code from one and like put it in the other one, pretty much is what we're talking about. But, there is the other option, the more destructive option that, I wouldn't recommend you do all the time, but you can do it. Is that you could just delete, you just delete the branch, right? And after you delete the branch, he could just now go back into his terminal and, make sure that he pushes his changes to the right place.
So for some reason, this created all kinds of mix-ups here. I might have to just do that again. I'm going to go git fetch. Okay, so now I'm going to say, so what I just did there, doing this live, there's a little snag there, right? So we're figuring this out and problem solving. So I did git fetch, which is going to pull in all the like repository information from the remote repository up in GitHub, and that'll let it know that there is also a main branch. So now what I'm going to say is git push up to the origin, but on the main branch instead. Maybe not. Let's try this again. Let's start back here. Cecil, do you know what I need to do actually then? I can't switch it to main.
Yeah, I think what's happening is because locally on your machine, you're in master. So by default, if you do a git pull, it's going to do git pull from master, right? So probably what you need to do is you can either one, set up a main branch, right, on your machine. Because again, if you look at your terminal, you see it says master, right? You can either set up a main branch on your machine and then do a git fetch, or, you know, I think you can do a git pull origin master or something like that. Like you got to be specific. Yeah. Or something like that. And then it should be able to pull that down.
Oh, there we go. And now if I do git push, so that should sync things better.
Yeah.
Everything's up to date. Now if I do a compare, still saying there isn't anything to compare. Okay.
Is your code up there? No, your code's not up there. Yeah, do a git status maybe. Want to see what it says?
Your branch is up to date.
Branch is clean. Okay.
All right, git push origin main now.
There we go. All right, and so now it says fail to push some references to that. Yeah, honestly, if I was you, I would just say I would go ahead and do a git switch. I'll just say git switch. What's that thing called? Git switch main here locally. Yep. Enter. Right. So notice now you're on the main branch on your machine. I'd do an ls to see what files are in the repo. Right. So you see now you did the ls, like there's nothing in there, right? Unrelated histories, you have to do a -- allow unrelated histories. I'm sorry, folks, this is getting a little complicated. But allow unrelated history. I think that's what it's called. Hit enter. It's called. There you go. See it right there? Stop. Oh, you passed it. Go back up. Yeah, there you go. Unrelated histories. There you go.
There we go.
Okay, great.
Now let's refresh.
Well, you just did a pull, right? Remember, you did a pull. You didn't do a push yet. So it's still not going to show. So if you want, you can do git push origin main. Now refresh it.
There we go. All right. All right. So moving on. Very quickly. Next step in the workshop is to go to the next part of the workshop. Now our code is now on GitHub. Let's set up Azure Static Web Apps. All right, now the fun part. Create Azure Static Web App. You're going to navigate to the Azure portal, which I've done already. We're going to click on create a resource, and we're going to choose for static web apps and click create. So let's do that. I'm already kind of here. We're going to search for static web apps just to show folks what's going on. Or no, we want to go home, create a resource, static web apps. Search for that. We're going to click create. And we're going to enter in some information called ASWA-dogs. We're going to sign into GitHub and all this fun stuff. So I'm just going to fly through this here. So I'm going to put it in a resource group. Here's my delete me later one. Create new. I always do this for demos so that I know. We're going to call it ASWA dogs. Choose a region that's close to you, or at least in the US, so central US for Texas, SKU free. And then this is the fun part. This is the part that's going to bring it all together. We're going to sign in with GitHub. It's opening up another browser on my other window here saying, do I want to sign in. I'm going to click continue. And then do I want to authorize Azure Static Web Apps to my GitHub account? I'm going to say authorize apps. Authorize it. I'm going to have to sign in. So just a moment really quick.
So no, just while Brian's doing that, when he says he needs to authorize it, what happens is that GitHub is going to pop up a little window, kind of like those OAuth windows. If you've ever seen like sign in with Facebook, sign in with Twitter, sign in with LinkedIn, sign in with stuff. But essentially what he had to do was it's going to pop up the window and it's going to ask, hey, do you want to allow GitHub or do you want to allow Azure Static Web Apps access to your GitHub account? Right. And the reason why it's needed for this particular product is because it's going to use that repository. It's going to create some things. It's going to make it easy for you to deploy it. So hence why it's needing to be able to ask for some of those things. So again, it's not doing anything crazy or malicious. It's not going to go and like write code for you. Well, just a little bit, not a lot of code, but it's not going to go and do anything crazy in your Git repository. And as you see in a second, when Brian comes back and he continues, he'll be able to select a repository that he wants to attach this resource inside of Azure too.
Yes. So I was able to successfully sign in, entered my password. I remembered it. I have an app that remembers it for me. And then what we want to do is look for the organization. So you might be part of multiple organizations, or you might not have any. It might be just your GitHub account name. So for me, I'm going with Clarkio. And then I'm going to choose a repository. It's going to take a second to kind of load up what repositories I have, but I can start filtering it. And I want the ASWA dogs one, and we're going to choose the main branch. And then that's about it, I think, that we need to do. Let's just double check. Configure build details. On build presets, choose custom. We're not using a framework. I think that's here. We choose custom. And then in terms of options, we have the app location is just that /, and then API locations, API. We can go next from there. In terms of tags, we're just going to go to the review and create. We're going to skip over that, go review and create. And this is just going to let you know what you're about to start doing. To give a almost like, as if you were at an e-commerce site and you were ready to check out, you wanted to review your order really quick kind of thing. Not that you're ordering anything here, but it's just making sure that the resource that you want to create, in this case, static web apps, has everything set up the way that you want. So maybe if you accidentally entered in the wrong name or something like that, you can go back and correct it. So I'm going to click on create now. And then that's going to start initializing that. The deployment is in progress. So what it's going to do behind the scenes, it's going to create space for your application up in Azure that's like reserved for your application. And then it's going to hook into your GitHub repository that you pointed out and put in through all those settings there, and pull that code, those resources, the HTML file and the JavaScript file that we created. So like we saw over here in VS Code, it's going to pull that into the application, that area that the static web app is going to be hosted, and start hosting it so that when people, and then create a URL under azurewebsites.net, I believe is going to be the domain. It's going to be, and you'll have a custom subdomain based on your app name. And you're going to be able to go to it and check it out and see it up and running. So it looks like your deployment is complete. Let's just double check on some things here. Once it's done, we want to explore it a bit more. So let's go to the resource since it's done. Let's make this big so we can see things better. And in here, since it's sliding to the right. So when you click on explore, or you click on that resource that you created, Azure Static Web App, the ASWA dog's name, you get this overview page, which tells you a little bit about where your app is running and where to go. In particular, you're going to want to look at the URL. So if I right click on this and go to a new tab, we can see there it is. It's up and running. And again, this is my extension that was doing that. It's up and running and being hosted in the cloud. So this is a publicly available domain, like URL that you all can go to if you wanted to check out. And you can see it running. So like within a matter of minutes, not even, that was all deployed and running based on our project that we pushed up to GitHub. So I know it took a little bit longer because of a little snag we ran into with the Git management and getting that pushed out there. But that was it very quickly, what happened there. Now, in addition to that, what we have here in the workshop is, so we're exploring via the overview, the URLs, the site is the URL, English, the URL of your site is randomly assigned. So fear not, if you want a custom domain, you can click custom domains on the left over here, which is going to be this option, which just to show you like the actual one right there. And so you can assign it a custom domain that you would like and go through the steps for that if you need to for your project, assuming you bought a domain that you can assign to it. And then if you want to edit the workflow, the link under edit workflow will take you to the GitHub Actions YAML. YAML stands for yet another markup language file in your repository. And what that does is it's like configuration, basically. It's telling Azure and GitHub how to manage this application and how to deploy it, basically. So we can go into details, but like they set it all up for you. That's kind of what Cecil was talking about, I think, when he was mentioning that it writes some code for you, in that they set all that up for you, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you wanted to have like a staging or a production environment, like Christopher's pointing out here in this, you could start creating separate things like that via the environments view that will affect that. All right, so navigate to your site and see it live. So congrats to all of us. We've now successfully deployed our web page to Azure. Now it's time to add some server code. But I think given the time frame that we have right now, we got about 8 more minutes, I think. How are we doing on questions so far, Cecil? Because I think that's the main part of things. And I imagine other people might already have like an API that they're maybe using and they want to call from this UI for their hack project.
Yeah, not a lot of questions. So I've been looking at the YouTube because we are on YouTube as well. I've been looking at YouTube and as well as inside of Zoom. Not a lot of questions. We did have a comment earlier that was telling you that you needed to set your default branch. You could set your default branch to master, but that's when we were having those issues with the that minor little snafu with GitHub. But we sorted that out. But no other comments or questions. Again, if folks are understanding what's happening, let us know. If you're not, if you need us to slow down or repeat anything, let us know as well. One thing I do want to add to what Brian was talking about just a few moments ago is that from the static side, like what you saw us do or what you saw Brian do was create like a very simple website, like it's an HTML file and a JavaScript file and some Bootstrap CSS that like came from outer space, right? And we're able to deploy it and run it in a very easy way. But if you had code that used something else, when I say something else, I mean if you're familiar with any JavaScript framework like Vue.js or React.js or Angular.js or whatever else they might be there, it has support for those things as well. So it will build and run and it'll create like a proper deployment of those frameworks for you. And all you'd have to do is just essentially point it, kind of like what we did when Brian created that resource in Azure. You just have to point it to the folder and it'll figure it out. So which is a great thing too. So again, we saw a simple case, but the application itself, like the JavaScript and the CSS and the complexity of the static nature of the thing itself could be, definitely a lot more. But I think this was a good example of how we could get started and see what that looks like. Oh, and then I'm also looking in the chat really quick. Also, everyone, please remember to fill out the attendance form if you want to submit it to the Beginners Challenge. And there's a link in the chat if you want to go ahead and do that. So again, please remember to submit your attendance forms. It's important. If you wanted to get, I guess you get points or credits or something like that for attending. And we also feel good that you attended too. We appreciate you spending the hour with me and Brian. That's always a good thing for you to do. But yeah, Brian, we don't have a lot more time left back. I mean, maybe we could just talk about functions really quickly instead of actually going through and deploying it, because we're not going to be able to deploy that in 4 minutes. So maybe we could just talk through it real quick.
Sure. So I'm going to go to docs.microsoft.com. I want to make sure this is off. I need to change the theme, just the dark theme. And in here, I'm going to search for functions. Or serverless, maybe. Let's search for serverless. And for whatever reason, it keeps changing my theme.
Yeah. Do you have? Okay, there you go. I think you passed it. Like it was at the bottom when you were scrolling.
I got it. Yeah. So, but like it goes back to high contrast.
No, I'm talking about like the Azure Functions thing. That's what I was talking about. It's like at the bottom.
Oh, I got you. Serverless web application. Is that the one? Or you said at the bottom? Create serverless logic with Azure Functions. Which one were you thinking?
That wasn't it. Oh,
there
maybe.
It is.
You got
Azure
it?
Functions documentation. I'll drop this in the chat too. A link to it.
Yeah.
So folks can check that out if they'd like. But Azure Functions is used. It's basically a technology. It's called serverless, which serverless is kind of like a loaded term in my opinion, because there are servers involved, But the idea is that you don't have to worry about managing the servers yourself. You can essentially just write code that gets executed. And when it's done running its execution, then those resources, that server that was helping to run it is kind of reallocated elsewhere or whatever. Like you don't have to worry about any of that. Azure handles it for you. It's kind of like, to me, another like way of thinking about it. It's like it's servers are to serverless as wires are to wireless, right? You're still able to, with your wireless router, connect and do things, but it still requires some wire behind your router to connect to your modem and have that in the first place, right? So, but you're still getting access to the internet connection via your router, just wirelessly instead of wired. And it's kind of like that with serverless. Like you're behind the scenes, it's using servers, but you're getting to just use what you need to use, and you don't have to worry about managing it. So that's what Azure Functions is about. It's about running functions. So functions being, or methods, depending on what your programming background might be, or the language that you're using and how that's described. So functions are methods. You'll be able to execute and run some code just for the amount of time that it needs to. And then when it's done and sends a response, or just at least outputs whatever you need it to do, then you're only like kind of using and consuming the resources for that period of time. So that's the beauty of it. Cecil, anything to add to that?
Yeah. No, I think that was great. The only other thing that I would probably add to it is, well, what do I use that for? Like what are some use cases for using an Azure function? And if you think about it, if you think about what Brian said, and it's really just me running like a little bit of code without me having to create like an entire project or an entire website or an entire thing, right? Like it's just a little bit of code that I want to run. And so folks can do a lot of interesting things with that. So for instance, a lot of folks have work that gets triggered on a timer. So maybe you want to say every 5 minutes, I want to like scrape this website, or I want to run my machine learning model. Maybe not every 5 minutes for the machine learning model, but ever so often at a particular interval, like I want you to do some stuff, right? And you could do it in Python, you could do it in Java, JavaScript. I think we support Bash to some extent, and PowerShell, right? Like there's a few different languages that it supports. And you could write your code and you could say, hey, every 5 minutes, I want you to run this. Or you could write some cron expression. Or you could have it triggered by something like an HTTP request. So which is good for like callbacks, right? If any of you have done like webhooks or callbacks where, someone subscribes to you and like, when an event happens, like maybe every time some new user subscribes to your product or someone new downloads your app, like there's a callback that triggers and says, hey, I want you to like do some stuff for me. And that stuff might be like, hey, I want you to like engage with like the email server, or I want you to add like a thing to the database or whatever, like anything that you can think of that you want to do, like just a little bit of code and you want to go ahead and run it. Again, without having to worry about like the infrastructure and the hosting of that code, right? Like I don't have to think about virtual machines and web servers and all that stuff. I just say, here, Mr. Azure, here's some code. Could you run this for me, please? Thank you very much. And then you walk away, right? And all is good with the world. And if you remember from earlier when Brian was on that Azure for Students page, you saw that you get 1 million executions of that for free. So that means that you can run functions, right? Not necessarily the same function, but like you can run a collection of functions up to 1 million occurrences every month, which is great. So, I mean, you might have some really intensive projects that y'all are working on in school that need more than 1 million requests. And even if that's the case, Azure Function is actually pretty cheap. But, I think for most folks, at least for me personally, I've never run over more than 1 million functions, 1 million function requests a month. But, again, all that just to say, like, you have that flexibility to be able to use this thing, and you could use it for free, and it's not going to take up your $100 credits that you already have for your subscription.
Yeah. This is well, one, I like how you called it, hey, Mr. Azure, can you do this for me?
Sure.
I hadn't heard anybody describe it that way. The one thing that kind of sticks out to me is that like when, thinking back to when I was in college, Azure was around then, I think. I kind of knew about it, but I didn't know like all the capabilities that it could have helped me out with in terms of like doing my side projects and stuff like that. And it's just kind of cool to see this stuff and what's available at a free level. It's like a good reminder to me too, because I see stuff being added over time that we have just for free, or even my own personal side project. So yeah.
For sure. Well, so Brian, I think we're at time or just a little bit over time. So what I do want to say is, first of all, thank all of you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Good luck in your hackathons. Judging is tomorrow. So we'll be, at least I'll be here for judging tomorrow to be able to see some of the great things that y'all create. If you do want to continue and probably follow through with this workshop about, in its entirety, Brian did share the link to the workshop. It's on GitHub. It's free. It's, you'd even need a GitHub account to read it, but you probably need a GitHub account to actually participate in it because it does use some GitHub things. But yeah, go ahead and if you feel so, go ahead and finish the workshop. Give us some feedback and let us know. You could create a GitHub issue. You could just contact Brian and I. We're both on like LinkedIn and Twitter and whatever else wherever else you want to reach us at. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's about it, right? Brian, you have any other closing words?
No, that's it. Thank you. Like Cecil said, thank you all for joining us. We'll be in the Discord. Like I'll be around hanging out a little bit today, monitoring the Discord, the Microsoft channel in there. So if you want to get connected in there, you're running into stuff, let us know. We're here to help. And there's a bunch of other colleagues of ours and student ambassadors that are available to help out with things. So as you're hacking on these projects, just hit us up. We're happy to help. And I see Harsha in chat was saying, thanks for hosting this awesome workshop. Finished going through the Azure deployment process, and it's great. We're happy to hear that. Thank you for sharing.
Nice.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Good luck.
Right, bye.